growing up in the 50s and 60s in Compton, California, I had friends from many different nationalities. My father was not happy about my black and brown-skinned friends. As a teen, we would argue about this endlessly. As an adult, I still do not understand where hatred of other comes from. Even the Rig Veda, it talks about driving away the impious, voracious, dark-skinned Rakshasa. Please, Igor, can you share some insight into this age-old problem of racial discrimination and prejudice? It's a very edgy, very uneasy question. Uneasy because it brings up to the surface certain things that why one way or another affects many cultures, maybe all cultures. So let us look into this. What are the roots or the origins of racism? And the questioner here even adds the line from the Rig Veda, right? One of the one of the most celebrated Vedic scriptures. We can, of course, find analogies also in the Bible. We can find analogies in some other sources where the kind of like the juxtaposition that, the dark skin, a character, a hero of the story, or the villain of the story. Like, for example, in Ramayana, the greatest demon of all, Ravana, was a dark skin. It was dark, deep, dark, brown, black, how the verses and how that epic describes him. So what do we make out of that? What I welcome you, first of all, to consider is this. It is actually in the very term itself. The word race, racism, comes from that term race. When there is this distinction, lingual distinction, put in place, and at some point, this may be known to some of you who went through the studies. For some of you, maybe this will come as a surprise, but racism wasn't just some kind of a natural phenomena that occurred in order to justify the colonization of the world by so-called civilized or so-called most civilized cultures. They had to come up, these cultures, those cultures, they had to come up with some fitting ideology which will justify how the native people of this or that part of the world will be treated. And of course, they cannot be treated as equals because that will defeat the very premise upon which colonialism was found. So they would have to be proved to be inferior. And that whole, again, going back to that term, shared consensus, a shared consensus was created where it has been, when it would have to become accepted by all members of that society, that there is indeed a difference, and a great difference perhaps, in terms of evolutionary development of certain cultures, or certain, in this case, certain races, as opposed to those where the economical, colonial reasons went to for the goods, to put it plainly. So the scientists of its time were busy to come up with this so as to give the justification. Not any justification. It's not enough just to say our etalons of beauty or our etalons of this or that. It has to come up with something which will scientifically, with reference to that time, will explain how this is so and so. Why would a so-called white race of Europe, mainly, be more superior than many other races of other parts of the world? So scientists in England and Germany in particular were busy coming up with mind-boggling and mind-bending theories which created the whole term race, and the word racism only followed. So I want you to trace first back the origin and the etymology of the word, because this is one of those prime examples how the language and the way the language is used and the way the language operates sees something and turns it into something. So in this case, the very term racism simply derived from that creation of the theory of races. And maybe in the department of ethnography, and in department of paleontology, and in department of what have you, when the origins of man were looked for, where all the fossils were hunted to find out where and how, this was early days. But back in the 18th century, or even before, going back before, this is where that term really firmly entered the language of many countries in Western Hemisphere, because it simply needed the justification of how this would allow, often and in most cases, inhumane treatment of other people who were simply considered to be inferior. They don't even feel it. You may, like to the peers of the day, the argument would be posed that how can you even apply certain norms if those people, barbarians or what have you, they do not even have this part developed in their nervous system. The shape of their skull, the evolution of their brain, and everything was scrutinized, and everything was mapped out. If you look at these manuals, if you look at these so-called scientific papers, you would be absolutely stunned what arguments were brought up when human being was scrutinized and put on the evolutionary ladder of development in terms of which race developed more. But it's not just going back, back to those centuries. These same perspectives were applied in the 20th century. We know that by the ideology of the fascism. The Nazis' ideology also had this as what they refer to refined byproduct of the way the nature had it, where they were simply placed into that position of the master race on the account of simply being more evolved. So they're taking that shepherding role on the planet. They're shepherding the evolution of other species and deciding the course of history. This was not just speeches of lunatics from of the podiums. It was all in the couloirs and in the salons of the educated, as a cocktail party, after dinner party, before dinner party. It's just the conversations were unfolding in such a way that will allow people to come up with the justification of how you can treat another human being. So, taking us back to the question itself, and where this old age problem comes from, I don't believe for a minute, for a split of a second, and I've seen that this has been done, the attempts at pinpointing that the origins of racism go all the way back to the way human beings lived always, so as to justify, just to show, either to show that this kind of persecution was there already in the ancient times, or to show it to those who want to find the justification that is indeed the natural, normal state of affairs. You see, racism has always existed as part of being human being. This, to me, sounds highly improbable and does great disservice if the translation of certain epics, scriptures, and so forth are being transferred into our culture. Because even the word today, if you say black and white, in where I grew up, nobody even for a moment will think that is spoken in relation to racial tension. But anyway, in the United States, if you say blacks and whites, black and white, it somehow already resonates in the whole field of neurophysiology of a being, because they've been exposed to that for so long. They've been exposed to that generation after generation, you see? It's a very different thing. It doesn't mean that racism or the nationalism or certain preferences don't exist in the part where I grew up. It may be in relation to different nations, to different people, group of people. But what I'm trying to say here is that all this boils down to the term itself. So the word, language, crystallizes it into something. And that crystallization into something brings this into what today is being polemized and discussed and talked about as racism. You see? Therefore, I was really impressed and completely share that perspective when brilliant African-American actor Denzel Washington, when he was asked in the heat of all these discussions at some point in the United States, he refused to go into the existing paradigm of that, how the language holds and pinpoints everything. He simply refused. He refused to be even identified with that, what will be called as blacks versus whites. Not that he doesn't hold the sentiment, not that he doesn't identify and doesn't belong or doesn't sympathize or may even feel deep down at the genetic level a certain sense of justified sense of injustice. But he spoke from a place of a higher consciousness, to my degree, where he would not even allow the conversation to proceed in that way with him, because he didn't want to support these notions, you see? So in other words, that question itself, roots of racism, as bizarre as it sounds, they are in the very etymology of the term itself. It's easy to say, of course, well, roots of racism and ignorance. Yes, this is another way how answer could have been constructed. The roots of anything is in ignorance. Anything. But where does that take us here? We could say is roots of racism is in the ignorance that everything is consciousness. And every human being is an expression of that consciousness. So therefore, every human being has the right to be counted and appreciated and respected as nothing other than consciousness. Yes, of course, we can speak about this, and some of the spiritual movements, when they were marching to the West from the Orient, from the East, they were making these statements unapologetically clear so as to transcend all these differences. So to put it clearly and to cut through all this, that these teachings are to the core of it all. And everyone, irrespective of their gender, walk of life, wherever they are, race and what have you, free to partake in these teachings. But here, that bit, that addition in that question, where is that hatred comes from? Where is that prejudice comes from? Prejudice is fabricated. Fabricated, created. Because at some point, it served the collective narrative. At some point, where it came from was simply a justified way of how to rule other people. It's as simple as that. At some point, one needs to go to another land, dock a ship, go on a land, capture people, put them in a ship, and transport them across the seas. I mean, can you imagine, like for a moment now, you cannot just do this, you see? You can't just do this because, there is eye contact, there is this, there's screams, there's wailing, there's this and that. I'm not talking about who is doing that work. I'm not talking about, who have been recruited to do this work. But someone who makes this decision to colonize any part of the world. Racism is not just with regard to, what happened to African Americans, because this is where a lot of conversation in the United States, for instance, has been taking root. The racism is so multivalent that it's absolutely extraordinary how all this is messed up and why it is messed up. One needs to go and see clearly. Because at some point, it serves the purpose to come up with something which will serve as that ideological ground of certain superiority against or in contrast with what would come as inferior. And whatever is inferior can be treated as inferior. The history of the United States in itself is inseparable from the extermination of the native people. This is the very, very birth of the country. It's not for me to talk about it because the sons and daughters who raised on that land looked into this and continuously looking into this, how that happened. You see? So, these are my reflections on this age-old problem of racial discrimination and prejudice. Beware of ideology. Beware when something is being made into ideology to sell as truth. Because, of course, we could argue that, well, some people may be objected to that at the time. Not everyone agreed. But it took hold. And what we're dealing with now is still reverberations, that residue that is left there. that residue that is left. Until it can fully, until it can fall back onto itself, until consciousness can reabsorb it all. But if the language holds it, if the words like racism used and reinforced with what they represent, then the conversation unfolds in these dynamics where it's not bringing any resolution, it's not bringing any healing, it's not bringing any reconciliation. It simply reinforces it at a very subtle level, at the level of vibration of the term itself. At the level of vibration of the term, because it has that race, belonging to that race, identifying with race, you see?